Good evening. Welcome to Dysautonomia International's webinar on anti-inflammatory treatment options for autoimmunity when plaquenil is not available. We were very happy to be joined this evening by Dr. Ilene Ruhoy, who is the founder of the Center for Healing Neurology in Seattle, Washington. I met Dr. Ruhoy maybe a year or two ago at a medical conference, and I just thought she was exceptionally cool and had such a passion for helping people with dysautonomia and autoimmune diseases and other complex medical conditions. So we're very happy to have her joining us tonight to present on this very timely topic. So Dr. Ruhoy, I'll pass it over to you, and at the end we can take some questions. And during the webinar, people can type in some questions on your webinar toolbar. There might be a place where it says questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the session.
Great.
So
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that. So I'm very happy to be talking about this topic, and I'm honored that I was invited. So thank you for the invitation. I think it's a very focused topic, obviously. So there's a lot to be said about autoimmunity in general and anti-inflammatory as well. But we're speaking specifically to those who have been reliant upon plaquenil. And so I try to sort of focus some of the recommendations on really about that drug and what that drug does for many people who suffer from autoimmune disease. So I have no disclosures, and just a little bit about autoimmune disease. So it's basically a defect in the mechanism of immunological tolerance, right? So if there's a failure in the body's ability to differentiate cells from the body from cells of some foreign body of sorts, whether it's infectious or exposures. And so there's an increase in self-reactivity, and it's thought to be a cross-reaction between foreign and self-antigens. And so with this defect in the mechanism of immunological tolerance, you have activation of both cellular and humoral mechanisms of immune response against the self-antigen. So it's immune-mediated. There is a self-antigen and it's self-damaging. So the body recognizes the self as something foreign and then proceeds to try to attack it in various ways. And that piece of self can of course, be parts of many different parts of our system. So different organ systems, whether it's part of the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, the enteric nervous system. We do know that autoreactive T helper cells are found to be the protagonists of autoimmunity. I mean, I think to be fair, most autoimmune diseases also have a B cell component, and probably in some situations there is involvement of the natural killer cells, which are part of the innate immune system, and there's probably some antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity. So I do think it's a spectrum of what is involved, but we have known that autoreactive T helper cells do induce autoimmunity. And these cells express a CD4 protein on their surface. And they play a key role in the immune system, and they do various things. And so they activate cytotoxic T cells, which can rip apart cells that have been infected by a virus, as well as macrophages. They help mature B cells into plasma cells and memory B cells and induce antibody production by the B cells. And they also play a role in recruitment of neutrophils and eosinophils and basophils to areas where there's infection and inflammation. So they play a very important role, and we know that they are key in autoimmunity. And there's a spectrum of severity when it comes to autoimmune disease. I think that there are some benign and mild or tolerable autoimmune disorders, or at least in terms of its severity, that don't really disable a lot of people. But I think that overall, I think autoreactivity, as we call it, so the body's reaction to itself, is a little bit more nuanced than that. I know back in the turn of the 20th century, biologist Paul Ehrlich called it horror autotoxicus, and I think that was more the pathologic form of autoimmunity. But I do think there's a wide spectrum of severity. Autoimmunity affects 20 million Americans. It seems to be predominantly in women, though not completely, obviously. And there's an increase in frequency. In fact, there have been recent studies that have shown that autoimmune disorders are increasing in incidence and prevalence in the United States over the last decade. And there's lots of theories abound as to why. But that's, I think, an area of concern and something that we need to do further research on. So why is there autoimmune disease? Well, I guess the short answer is we're not completely sure. We have a lot of ideas and a lot of theories that I think hold some weight. We do think infections are a major cause. We're exposed to a lot of infectious organisms. Obviously, we're currently in this turbulent time of ours, sort of dealing with COVID-19, which is the reason why we're having this particular topic of the talk, which we are going to get to. There is something called molecular mimicry. So some viruses and bacterium have proteins that look like proteins that are of our cells, that are of our own cellular machinery. And so sometimes the immune system can get a little confused. They form an antibody or they form some immune response. They mount an immune assault against an infectious organism, and along its way, they sort of see something that looks similar, and they attack that. So there is a molecular mimicry that probably plays a very large role. We think exposure sort of weaken the immune system and sort of initiate a cell danger response so that our bodies and our cells have less reserve to counteract any kind of assault from exposures. Certainly stress does a similar thing in terms of just using up our reserves and weakens the immune system over time. Certainly chronic stress has been proven to do that. Their genetics definitely play a role. I mean, so I think we have a genetic, we all have a certain genotype, and how those genes are expressed and how our variants are expressed can certainly play a role in our vulnerability or our susceptibility to disease, specifically autoimmune disease. Comorbidities, so other kinds of underlying disease processes, whether that's metabolic in nature or even cancer related, or treatments for things such as cancer and other kinds of disease, neurodegenerative disease certainly, can create, again, more of a vulnerability to our bodies to begin an autoimmune process. And then, of course, there's increased risk with one autoimmune disease. We often say that a great risk factor for getting an autoimmune disease is having another autoimmune disease. So I think overall, I think what our bodies and our souls and our minds go through, I think creates sort of a nidus of inflammation in our bodies that helps to reduce our ability to be resilient and to mount an appropriate response. So hydroxychloroquine, so used for a lot of different autoimmune diseases. As you know, historically it treats malaria, but it's very commonly prescribed in this country for autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, primary Sjogren's. So it's very commonly used in this country, and many people are on it. It is an alkalinizing lysosomatropic drug. So it actually targets the lysosomes. Hydroxychloroquine is a sulfate where the chloroquines are phosphate salts, but they're both a class of drugs known as 4-aminoquinolones. But hydroxychloroquine is what's used because while it has similar mechanisms as chloroquine, it's less toxic. It's thought to be more potent. And there are fewer concerns of drug-drug interactions. It's safe in pregnancy. It can prevent or delay organ damage, including bone destruction. It certainly prevents disease flares and promotes long-term survival when one is suffering from an autoimmune disease. And we know that it accumulates in lysosomes where it can inhibit some of the important functions of lysosomes. And the way it does that in terms of its molecular mechanism is not completely elucidated. We do know that as a weak base, it accumulates in acidic vesicles, and the lysosomal compartments are acidic vesicles, and it increases the pH. So by increasing the pH, it seems to interfere with lots of lysosomal functions. It's absorbed in the upper intestinal tract, and after absorption, it's got a pretty long half-life, actually, about 40 to 60 days. So I've seen literature which sometimes it states it shorter half-lives, but sometimes it states it longer, but it seems to be an average of 40 to 60 days. It is highly anti-inflammatory, so it helps to impair antigen presentation via the lysosomal pathways. So lysosomes contain hydrolytic enzymes, and they cooperate with other vesicles to digest stuff from inside the cell and stuff from outside the cell, and they're involved in basically recycling cellular substrates. But they're also involved in antigen processing and presentation, and that's an important part of autoimmunity and autoreactivity. There are antigens that are presented by the T helper cells, and that's what induces the immune system to attack it. So it actually interferes with that antigen processing and presentation, which helps to reduce the level and the severity of the autoimmune disorder. It suppresses the increase of immune factors, so lots of cytokines and chemokines. The ones that have been most reported on are IL-6, IL-10, IL-1, interferon alpha, and tumor necrosis factor. It also interferes in toll-like receptor pathways. There are several different toll-like receptors and it interferes in several of them, and those pathways are part of the cellular signaling that goes on. So again, it sort of reduces the ability of antigen processing and presentation in an effective and appropriate way so that the immune system doesn't really have the chance to create an autoreactivity. It also binds to nucleic acids of our genome and helps to block the signaling effect. What's nice about hydroxychloroquine versus some of the other immunomodulators that we use in autoimmune disease, it's not really been associated with increased risk of infectious complications or cancer. So it doesn't have any of those dreaded kinds of long-term risks. Oftentimes, patients will complain of GI kinds of concerns, so gastrointestinal, sort of stomach upset, distension. So what's feared about the hydroxychloroquine, of course, is the cardiotoxicity, but it seems to be well tolerated in those who do not have a cardiac history and otherwise have normal cardiac exams. It can induce arrhythmias, cause a prolonged QT in certain susceptible individuals, and also produce a cardiomyopathy in some. And of course, what the commonly reported side effect is the retinopathy, and that's why it's recommended to get regular eye exams. But it seems the retinopathy doesn't occur until you're on high dose for a fairly long term, and that long term seems to be give or take 5 years. So hydroxychloroquine was recently found in some studies, of course, to inhibit growth of COVID-19. The initial studies were on chloroquine, and then they also looked at hydroxychloroquine, and they seem to have similar mechanisms. They think there's some glycosylation of viral proteins that go on, but the mechanism by which the hydroxychloroquine seems to protect patients from getting sicker when they've been infected is there's a change of pH at the surface of the cell membrane, and that inhibits the fusion of the virus to the cell membrane. It also inhibits the nucleic acid replication. So remember, viruses basically need our cell. They need our cellular machinery. So the virus infects the cell and basically kidnaps and holds hostage our genome, our DNA, and then it inserts itself into the DNA, and then it makes our DNA make its own RNA to help with viral protein production. And so the hydroxychloroquine has been found to inhibit some viral assembly and transport of these proteins. And it's thought to also be just drug-induced cytotoxicity. So the hydroxychloroquine has been found to be cytotoxic to the cells that have been infected by the virus. And it reduces a procoagulatory state. And we do know that a pro-inflammatory, certainly a chronic inflammatory state, results in a procoagulatory state. And in fact, some patients who succumb to COVID-19 are in a hypercoagulable state where they form blood clots, and there's difficulty in blood flow. And so hydroxychloroquine seems to also help that effect as well. So it's now regularly prescribed for COVID-19, but with certain restrictions, as it should be. Not everyone is following it, but in fact, just today, I think the CDC came out and said that it's just anecdotal reporting that this is beneficial, and it's not recommending it. I know the FDA had recently said that it could be used in sort of an emergent situations. Right now, the recommendations are really for only inpatient use. But many are not following that recommendation. And the truth is that if you look at the studies, they're all fairly small. Some of them are actually even equivocal or not positive. So to the effect that we think it's a wonder drug for COVID-19, I believe that the consensus is that it is not. But people are prescribing it for outpatients. A lot of patients are asking for it, those without autoimmune disease, but those who fear that they've either been exposed or want to use it for preventative purposes. But it hasn't even been looked at as a preventative. And then some providers are actually hoarding some supplies of the drug itself in the event that they or their patients would need it. But states are trying to get a hold of it. A lot of states have sent out regulations for prescribing providers that they're monitoring these prescriptions, so that if you're a physician who has never prescribed it, they're going to take note of that. If you're a prescription who has prescribed it, but there's been a recent uptick in the number of prescriptions, they're going to note that as well. So the state boards are actually trying to get involved to try to prevent the low supply of hydroxychloroquine. But regardless of all of this, it's still in short supply. So those who need it, actually, lots of doctors are either are prescribing it, but the patients aren't able to obtain it, or the doctors are lowering their dose in hopes that they can at least get some of it to try to minimize some of their symptoms. So my recommendation when you can't get the hydroxychloroquine, I think to be fair, it's a very hard question. Hydroxychloroquine has a very specific mechanism of action, and I think to replace it in any other way is probably a very difficult thing to do. I think that the closest that we can get to is by using quinine, which is really what had been used for malaria way back when. We don't use it because it's very toxic, and so there have been formulations made, which is the chloroquine and the hydroxychloroquine, but quinine is actually found in tonic soda. So I've been telling patients to drink tonic soda, basically, without the gin, of course. But so tonic soda contains quinine, and quinine is very much related to chloroquine. And chloroquine, as I had said, has very similar effects as hydroxychloroquine. It has been studied in terms of the COVID-19 and has antiviral effects. It also increases the late endosomal stage and the lysosomal pH, so it impairs the ability of the virus to do what it wants to do to our bodies. Chloroquine also seems to act as a zinc ionophore, so it allows extracellular zinc to enter the cell, and that inhibits viral RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. It inhibits thiamine uptake, which is necessary for viral replication and action. It decreases IL-1 and reactive oxygen species. It also inhibits lymphocyte proliferation and antigen presentation and lysosomal enzyme release, which again are important in the process of autoimmunity. So chloroquine has very similar, again, it's an analog of hydroxychloroquine, so it has similar effects, although less potent and more toxic, which is why we don't regularly use it. But then quinine, which is more toxic, of course, in medicinal dosages, has a very similar mechanism of action as chloroquine. And so you could get very safe dosages, of course, in tonic soda. So, people ask me, well, how many bottles of tonic soda should I drink? And I don't really have great answers because in terms of dosing, it hasn't really been studied all that eloquently. But I do think that a bottle of tonic soda a day can actually help at least mimic the mechanism of action of what hydroxychloroquine has done for a lot of people with autoimmune disease. It comes from the cinchona bark, this is sort of a picture of the plant. So that's where it comes from. It's very bitter tasting, which is why tonic soda is bitter in its taste. So beyond that, so that's the only thing that would specifically mimic that mechanism of action on any level. But I think that we can get close, though. I definitely think, the more you look at what is out there in the natural world to sort of help, decrease inflammation, decrease pain, improve the immune system, I think ultimately can have a great effect. And so, there are benefits. I always promote a plant-based diet, as my patients know, and I think that the benefits are really so well and so evidence-based and explained by antioxidant constituents of a plant-based diet, the lactobacilli and fiber that's present, and by potential changes to the intestinal flora. And I will talk a little bit about that when I talk about the role of dysbiosis. And then the Mediterranean diet has shown anti-inflammatory effects due to the protective properties of the amount of omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids and vitamins, but also by influencing the gut microbiome. And I think that not enough can be said about the role of the gut in immune function in general and in autoimmune disease in particular. And we do know that an inefficient antioxidant defense system has been linked to autoimmune disease, and I want to repeat that. And our antioxidants, the level of antioxidants within our system, our body creates its own endogenous antioxidants, but our food sources are really where they get the substrates to increase that antioxidant level. And so I think that a plant-based diet has such a wide range of antioxidants, and it makes an inefficient antioxidant defense system an efficient one. And so I think it's really important. And so in particular for the topic of this talk, I think things like sweet potatoes, which has great antioxidants of vitamin C, which I know is all over the news with regards to IV vitamin C and its treatment and prevention for COVID-19. So, but sweet potatoes have lots of vitamin C, which people don't think of sweet potatoes as having vitamin C. They often think of the citrus fruits, but red peppers actually and sweet potatoes have quite a bit of vitamin C. But also sweet potatoes are alkaline. And when I talked about the hydroxychloroquine, what they do is they alkalinize the lysosomal compartments. And that's an important piece of its mechanism of action. So the more alkaline you can be, I think the better benefit you will have. And of the various fruits and vegetables, the sweet potatoes actually have the highest pH. So I think that's really important to sort of consume vegetables that help to target what it is we're trying to treat. Medicinal mushrooms, I think, are tremendous for autoimmune disease. And there's been lots of research with regards to various species of mushrooms. But when you eat them raw, they contain very high levels of prebiotic oligosaccharides such as chitin and beta-glucans, which I really do recommend. And then the different species of mushrooms are shiitake, reishi, turkey tail, and wood ear, which are, the domestic cat mushrooms don't really have much medicinal purposes. You need some of the more exotic kinds, which I know can be expensive and sometimes you don't really know what to do with in the kitchen, but they really have quite a high level of nutritional compounds. Kale, I know we read about kale, and I think people are tired of hearing me talk about kale, but it's got some really great compounds. And importantly, it's got quercetin, which I'm going to talk about separately. Spinach, of course, again, the dark leafy greens have a lot of great compounds that are antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. Asparagus and garlic. And again, these are, and really no fruit or vegetable is off limits. And I know that there's questions about the nightshades and arthritis and such, and we can definitely talk about that. And you could certainly eliminate those if you're particularly sensitive to nightshades. But these are, for the purposes of this particular topic, these would be my choices with regards to the vegetables of what has the highest level of particular antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. Of course, healthy fats are really important, and I think that's why the Mediterranean diet has been shown to be very helpful in autoimmune disease. Black seed and borage oil have very high levels of GLA, gamma-linoleic acid, which is an omega-6. And black seed oil actually has also some turmeric, which I'll also talk about separately. Hemp seed oil has a perfect ratio of 369. I think the omega-6 and 9s have gotten somewhat of a bad rap in terms of its pro-inflammatory state, but omega-6 in particular, it's very important to help modulate inflammation. I mean, some level of an inflammatory response is actually very important for homeostasis of all sorts. And while the standard American diet gives us a 6-to-3 ratio of 18-to-1, it should probably be closer to 2-to-1 or even 1-to-1, but you need some level of non-omega-3 types of fats. And the hemp seed oil is a vegetarian alternative to fish oil. And some herbs that are particularly powerful with regards to immune function and immune support is astragalus and rosemary. And then, of course, alkaline. And it's not to say that if you need to go drink alkaline water. I don't really think there's tremendous benefit in doing that. I think if you just overall have a highly alkalinized diet, and most fruits and vegetables are of the alkaline side, I think that that's where you want to focus on. And again, just sort of referring back to the mechanism of plaquenil and how we understand that it works, I think that would be important. I've got a lot of questions about fasting. I think fasting is really important actually for autoimmunity. I think it's important for our immune system. There have been studies that show that if you fast for 3 days, you completely reset your immune system. I don't know if that's 100% true, but I do think there's great benefit to the immune system. I know that the immune system is regulated by nutrient availability in an energy state, and autoimmune disease has been characterized by dysfunctional lymphocytes and a metabolic dysregulation. And so during the fasting period, you have to recognize that energy is diverted. So usually when we're eating, 3 to 6 times a day, our blood flow has to be diverted to the gastrointestinal tract so that the GI tract can do all of its functions. And so it could digest and metabolize and absorb and assimilate and utilize, and that requires energy from our system. And so when we fast, we basically give the GI tract a break, and the energy and the blood can be diverted elsewhere. And that's where it can help go and repair organ damage from autoimmune disease, for example, or help support immune function, or help support the production of immune cells. And during the fasting period, the cells utilize liver glycogen as the main energy source, and then it switches to a non-hepatic glucose source, but also specifically to fat-derived ketone bodies and free fatty acids, which are used for energy. I don't think long-term fasting is a good idea. I mean, the brain does prefer the glucose molecule for its function, definitely, but initially, certainly short-term, it'll do just fine on working off of free fatty acids. And then in terms of what kinds of fasting, I think that there's lots of recommendations out there. Some people do alternative day fasting, some people do intermittent fasting, and that also comes in different subsets, whether they do 18 and 6 or 20 and 4, 16 and 8. I think there's all different types that you can do it. There's caloric restriction, of course, which is just every day eating a lower number of calories than you normally would. And there's the fasting mimicking diet, which has had lots of research behind it. And the fasting mimicking diet has actually been shown to help improve immune function. It causes apoptosis, which is cellular death of autoreactive T cells. And this is in the studies that were specifically on fasting mimicking diet. But if you look at the studies of even intermittent fasting, when done consistently and for a long term, it also has similar effects of causing apoptosis of autoreactive T cells, as well as for reducing inflammatory cytokines and chemokines and helping increase anti-inflammatory CD4 T regulator cells. So I think fasting plays a very important role, actually, and it's something that one can obviously be done without, on your own. I definitely advise getting some guidance from your physician, certainly, but it doesn't have to cost any money, and you can even design a fasting program that works well for you and your lifestyle. I mean, some people don't like alternative day fasting. Some people like to just not eat until a certain time of the day. Some people like to stop eating at a certain time of the day, and that just sort of works for their social life, work life, family life. And so that could be something that can be designed on your own. And we do know that intermittent energy restriction does alter blood adipokines and actually changes the gut flora. So again, dysbiosis plays a role, and it does promote protective effects. And also fasting, just as I said, potent immunomodulatory effects. So reduction in dendritic cells, which are one of the antigen presenting cells that I referred to earlier, reduce CD4 cells, apoptosis of autoreactive T cells. And then importantly, during this fasting stage, it actually increases the production of hematopoietic stem cell-based regeneration. So while there's apoptosis of cells that are reactive to our self, there's also an increase in stem cell regeneration, which then goes to repair any kind of organ damage. And I tried to show that on this nice chart that I had found in one of the articles, which sort of, the FMD stands for fasting mimicking diet. And this, again, this study was specifically about the fasting mimicking diet, but there is evidence and even other types of fasting that this does take place, which is that there is an improvement in the immune system, as well as an improvement in the body's ability to regenerate tissue to help repair any damaged tissue in any organ system that was caused by the autoimmune disease, because autoimmunity is inflammatory at its core. And any kind of chronic inflammatory cascade that isn't reined in will ultimately result in some sort of end organ damage. And again, different autoimmune diseases have different organ targets, but even in the same autoimmune disease in different individuals, they will have different organ involvement. But regardless, fasting can actually help, and that's the nice thing about stem cells, is that they are pluripotent, so they can become different types of tissue. So wherever the damage resides, they can migrate and help to repair that damaged organ tissue. And so dysbiosis, I think that a lot of people do suffer from intestinal dysbiosis. We know that it's a risk factor for development of autoimmune disease. There seems to be a very high rate of those with autoimmune disease in some level of gut alteration, whether it's SIBO or leaky gut or the different names that they give it. There's some stagnation in the way the gut moves and the way it functions. There's often a long history of dysmotility, and the gut microbiota is altered in some way, where it creates certain inflammatory compounds and releases certain inflammatory cytokines and chemokines, and upregulates cells that are more reactive in the immune system, and downregulate cells that are meant to protect our immune system. So I think that dysbiosis is something that needs to be addressed. So if you have any level of gut problems, and again, that could be in constipation or diarrhea. Usually people hold a diagnosis of irritable bowel disease, which is likely autoimmune in its etiology. And certainly, though, any kind of autonomic problem will create dysmotility. So there is that connection with autonomic dysfunction, autoimmunity, with gut dysfunction. So I think that if the more we address that, the better people seem to feel, and the better their autoimmune disease seems to be well managed. And it's not necessarily a cure for the autoimmune disease, especially once one exists and once one is diagnosed, but it certainly does minimize the symptoms of that autoimmune disorder. So I think addressing it, and that's it's certainly not my area But what I do for my patients with any kind of gut microbiota perturbation is that I talk about diet modifications, and we sort of briefly discuss some of my recommendations. Probiotics have definitely been helpful. I know oregano oil is often recommended, as well as Artemisia, which interestingly, Artemisia has been used for malaria in Asia. I don't know if it's similar. Hydroxychloroquine is also anti-malarial, of course, so there's some connection there. Berberine and garlic have also been regularly recommended, and patients seem to do really well when they use these particular recommendations in trying to treat their gut. Movement. So movement exercise has a lot of beneficial effects on the immune system. People ask me all the time, what about, all these studies that say too much exercise is not good for you? It is true that strenuous exercise has been shown to be pro-inflammatory and will produce reactive oxygen species. But moderate exercise has actually shown the complete opposite. It improves blood flow to organs and joints. It modulates inflammation. It increases anti-inflammatory mediators. It decreases stress response. Moderate intensity exercise is actually considered immuno-enhancing. And improvements in immunity are due to regular exercise, I think, are probably due to their reductions in inflammation, maintenance of any thymic mass, alterations in the composition of older and younger immune cells, and enhanced immunosurveillance, which I think is really important in autoimmunity because, again, as I said earlier, a risk of autoimmune disease is already having an autoimmune disease. And so there's already disrupted immunosurveillance. So anything that you can do to prevent the immune system from recognizing something of the self as something foreign can only be beneficial and actually preventative for further autoimmune problems. And so, again, moderate exercise has been shown to do that. And so I definitely recommend exercise. And moderate exercise is, it could just be going for a walk for 30 to 40 minutes. It depends upon, of course, your fitness level, and that's a whole other talk. But certainly some level of movement on a daily basis can only be beneficial for your immune system. A few supplements that I often recommend for autoimmune disease. N-acetyl is actually being recommended right now for COVID-19. It's a derivative of the amino acid L-cysteine, and it's a precursor of glutathione, so it actually helps to increase glutathione levels in the body. It's a source of self-hydryl groups, which is an antioxidant. So it's powerfully antioxidant, actually. NAC is a really great anti-inflammatory antioxidant. It inhibits markers of inflammation, such as phospholipid metabolism and pro-inflammatory cytokine release, such as TNF-alpha and interleukin-1, as well as protease activity. It also inhibits neutrophil activity, and it inhibits the respiratory burst, which is sort of this when there's an acute inflammatory response due to autoimmune disease, the cells react acutely, and the mitochondria react acutely, and it creates a lot of reactive oxygen species because of the acute increase of energy consumption by the mitochondria. And we also know that there's mitochondria deficits in autoimmune disorders and in any chronic inflammatory disorder. And as well as it decreases the NF-kappa B. So I think N-acetylcysteine is an important supplement to use. Turmeric, of course, everyone talks about turmeric, and I'm recommending it regularly for all kinds of reasons. It's a spice that's used in Asian food. It comes from the turmeric plant called Curcuma longa. Curcumin is a phenolic compound, and interestingly, so is quinone. So phenolic compounds are a class of chemical compounds that consist of a hydroxyl group that's bonded directly to an aromatic hydrocarbon group. And so I do think it's interesting that the quinones are another phenolic group. And the plant is a perennial herb, of course, and it's a member of the ginger family, which makes sense because turmeric and ginger make a very powerful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory duo. And so turmeric is, again, anti-inflammatory, analgesic. So for those autoimmune disorders that have a high component of things like arthritis or neuropathy, it's analgesic. It's antioxidant, as I had said, and it helps to induce apoptosis by arresting the cell cycle, actually. So, and what's nice is that it's safe. It has minimal toxicity, and its mechanism of action is from the rhizome or the roots of the plant. And as I said, the active constituents are the curcuminoids, but it also contains iron, potassium, and fatty acids that are just as important. And it helps to mediate pain hypersensitivity by its inhibition of certain receptors, but it also inhibits NF-kappa B activation, COX-2, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes, which are all very pro-inflammatory. And once again, turmeric helps to induce the apoptosis of the autoreactive cells. It also has antiplatelet effects, and coumarins are another phenolic compound. So I think turmeric is an important should be an important staple of everyone's diet, but definitely so if you have any chronic inflammatory disorder, of which obviously autoimmune disorders play a large role in that. Borage seed oil. So the borage seeds are pressed, and it creates this oil that has omega-6 fatty acid, gamma-linoleic acid. And as I said earlier, omega-6 really aid in the inflammatory response, so you need some of it. It helps also to decrease cholesterol, LDL, it increases HDL. So I think that some amount of omega-6 fatty acids in borage seed oil is actually very great for pain. They've done lots of studies on it and compared it with typical NSAIDs and other kinds of compounds that we use for pain control. It reduces the production of interleukin-1 and decreases the serum activity of interleukins 4 and 10. And it can decrease the activity of tumor necrosis factors. So you can see that there are some cytokines and chemokines that are very much involved, because there is a whole range of them, of course, but it seems like these few keep coming up with regards to the immune system and autoimmune disorders. Quercetin is really one of my favorite compounds, and it's even being recommended again for COVID-19. It's a flavonoid, and it's found in lots of fruits and vegetables, and I always like to give whole food sources because in general, I always recommend trying to get these compounds from whole food sources, because the body prefers things in whole food sources. It doesn't necessarily love a bunch of supplements, and I don't think anyone loves to take a bunch of supplements. So if you can get things in whole food sources, I think it's best for the body. It's much more bioavailable, that's for sure, without any of its excipients that are usually found in supplements, which is why, again, another reason why I promote a plant-based diet, because if you do focus on plants, you do tend to get a wide variety of the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds. Quercetin is also found in herbs such as ginkgo biloba, sambucus, and St. John's wort. It's very anti-inflammatory, antiviral, antioxidant, does quite a bit to stop the inflammatory cascade with its inhibition of lipid peroxidation, platelet aggregation, and capillary permeability. And it really plays a very large role in stabilizing the mast cells. So all of the histamine that's released, and the tryptase that's released, and the proteases, and leukotrienes, and prostaglandins, and bradykinins, it really does stabilize those mast cells so they don't release all those pro-inflammatory mediators as much. And importantly, it stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, which in autoimmune disorders, we do know that there is a deficiency in mitophagy, which is the turnover of mitochondria. And so quercetin is really nice in that it stimulates the mitochondrial biogenesis. So it inhibits the mitochondrial deficit that we often see in autoimmune disorders. It's got strong anti-inflammatory capacity. Again, it inhibits TNF alpha, a lot of the interleukins, inhibits production of some of the inflammation-producing enzymes. It also inhibits matrix metalloproteinases, which break down cellular membranes. So it just plays a very important role in trying to, again, reduce the inflammatory cascade. And I always say that quercetin has a panoply of molecular targets, because it really does. I mean, I can talk about quercetin. It inhibits cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase. It inhibits, certain receptor-mediated release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. It does quite a bit, and it really can be a powerful player in reducing inflammation of the body. Cat's claw is, I think, is not as commonly talked about, but I really am a fan of it. It's a climbing vine. It's a woody climbing vine in the Amazon forest, but I think it's found elsewhere. It's used in traditional medicine for gastric inflammation, and other inflammatory disorders. And again, when I talked earlier about the connection between the gut microbiome and autoimmune disease, I think that's why I find such a great benefit in my patients with cat's claw. So because traditionally it actually has been used for gastric disorders as well as for inflammatory disorders. And so the connection is already there. It stimulates activity of immune cells such as macrophages and T helper cells, and it does a lot to reduce inflammatory cytokines and chemokines as well. Melatonin, yeah. So this is my list of supplements. This is the last one that I recommend for autoimmune disorders. I sort of I try to just sort of pick my powerhouse of supplements for inflammation and autoimmunity. But I really like melatonin. It's an endogenous hormone, of course, produced in the brain, and melatonin helps to regulate the body's circadian rhythm. And if I always talk to my patients about how our bodies are circadian. So our systems are circadian, our brain is circadian. We are circadian beings, and we evolved to rise with the sun and go to sleep with the sun. And the more, and obviously that's very hard to do in modern life. It's definitely hard to do here in Seattle when it gets dark at 4 o'clock, in the middle of the winter, and stays dark till like 9 a.m. But the best that we can do to simulate it, I think the better off we are, because that really is how our body thrives, which is why a lot of our hormonal systems have certain rhythms. And so the melatonin just helps regulate that circadian rhythm of the body and of the immune system. And I think that that's an important thing that it does. And it's not necessarily for sleep all the time. For some people, it's actually been shown to be very neuroprotective. And so I think it does quite a bit. It just, in terms of it being a regulator of our entire immune system, because it decreases the upregulation and suppresses levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And I think it's one of its more important functions in terms of the immune system is it's a regulator of NF-kappa B, right, which is nuclear factor kappa light chain, which enhances the activation of B cells. And so it links to the cell danger response to pathogenic signals. And so, autoimmunity basically is our cell danger response, just sort of going awry and sort of sending out these signals. And eventually the body is overwhelmed. The stress systems of our body don't know how to react any longer, and they get sort of mixed up basically. And so they end up sort of sending out pathogenic signals. And so I think that melatonin can try to help minimize that and help regulate that a little bit better. And then beyond the supplements, Thymosin alpha-1, which has been well studied, there's quite a bit of literature on it, which is a naturally occurring thymic peptide of 28 amino acids. And it really does play a key role in the control of immunity, tolerance, and inflammation. It acts as an endogenous regulator of both inflammatory and adaptive immune responses. And I think that its effects are somewhat context dependent, because it does have a role in both innate immunity as well as acquired immunity. It's made from a compounding pharmacy, and it's been shown to be beneficial for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, as well as other autoimmune disease. Palmitoylethanolamide, I guess I had one more supplement that I wanted to talk about, PEA, which is a lipid autocoid, so it's a slightly different type of supplement. And it's derived from membrane phospholipids, and it's a naturally occurring molecule capable of modulating immune cells, such as mast cells. And again, it too minimizes the escalation of neuroinflammation. It actually plays a very large role as a stop signal for a perpetual inflammatory cascade. With autoimmunity, we lose that stop signal. So PEA actually helps to insert a stop signal, if you will, and it does it through certain feedback mechanisms using the peroxisome proliferator activated receptor, the PPAR alpha, which is a ligand-activated transcriptional factor that belongs to a family of nuclear receptors. So it does, through different feedback loops, it actually helps to sort of put a gate up against the inflammatory response. So I think PEA is an important, does come as a supplement, and I actually have a specific protocol for it, because I found that to use it in a certain way seems to sort of create more of a benefit. So I gave out my protocol, which is really starting high and then coming down off of it to sort of find where the least dose will give the maximum response. And because it's a lipid autocoid, you have to have it with some form of oil, basically, or some sort of fat. And then certain antioxidants enhance its effect, such as quercetin. So one of my great combinations that I like to recommend is PEA with quercetin and then turmeric with ginger. I think those duo combinations have been very effective for inflammation and autoimmunity. And then, of course, I'm asked about cannabis fairly often. I don't prescribe it, but I know a lot of my patients use it. I've read quite a bit about it here. Obviously, it's legal here in Washington State, as I know it's legal in many other states of the country. But I think it does actually play a very important role. There's quite a bit of research that support its use for anti-inflammatory as well as analgesic. And so cannabinoids, so it's important to recognize that we actually make endogenous cannabinoids, and we make something called anandamide, which is an analog to THC, which is a psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. And so it's responsible for most of the pharmacological actions of cannabis, including the psychoactive, analgesic, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and lots of others. I mean, it's written up to be antipruritic, which is it stops itching, bronchodilatory, antispasmodic, muscle relaxant. I mean, there's all kinds of different positive functions that's been attributed to THC. But we make endogenous THC as well. So I think that the more natural we can be, the more we will upregulate our endogenous production of an anandamide, which, interesting, ananda is the Sanskrit word for bliss, but that is the analog of THC. So I think we can make more endogenous effect in terms of not having to take the psychoactive component of cannabinoids. But we have two receptors. We have two cannabinoid receptors, the CB1 and the CB2 receptor. And so they are both 7-transmembrane G protein coupled receptors, and they play an important role in the peripheral, spinal, and supraspinal nociception, including the ascendant and descendant pathways. And so I think the CB1 in particular is found predominantly in the central nervous system, whereas the CB2 is found predominantly in cells involved with the immune function. So I think that's important because I think autoimmunity has a level of central nervous system involvement, even in terms of pain, for example. So I think that it's important to know that we have these two receptors. Now, interestingly, I think that the THC and the CBD actually, the THC is much more, has a higher affinity for these receptors, whereas the CBD part doesn't. In fact, the CBD is known to sort of regulate the binding of the THC, so it helps to sort of modify the THC's response. So it's that the CBD plays that important role in modulating how much the THC is going to bind to those receptors. But CB2 receptor, again, found in the periphery, activation of the CB2 receptors, it stimulates the release of the beta endorphins, which of course acts on the mu opioid receptors at the peripheral sensory neurons to inhibit nociception. And those with autoimmune disorders will often have pain, of course, of joints, but also neuropathy pain, so neuropathic pain. And CB2 may be upregulated in the microglia, where they modulate the neuroimmune interaction so that inflammation is less and peripheral nerve damage is less. And again, the stimulation of the CB2 receptors does not produce the cannabis-like effects in the psyche and the circulation because the THC really has a high affinity for CB1. So there are two different receptors that we're focused on, and that's why I think the cannabinoids can be very effective. Again, widely used for pain, anxiety, and all kinds of other diseases, and its recent use in many autoimmune diseases has been reported in the literature. And interestingly, it's also recently been demonstrated to have mild antimalarial activity, which of course is what plaquenil and chloroquine has been used for. And I gave some dosing recommendations, but I think the dosing is sort of all over the place right now with what people are in general recommending. It's well tolerated, certainly. There are two synthetic cannabinoids that are on the market, actually, dronabinol and nabilone, which are basically used for chemotherapy-associated nausea and vomiting. Because it has been approved for these kinds of indications, cannabis is actually not considered a supplement. It's actually FDA approved. So, as well as just being legal in some states at this point. Another option, of course, is other immunosuppressants. So, these are just other drugs which don't have the same mechanism of action as plaquenil does. But they have different mechanisms of actions, and in some of the research studies that they had done, even while it was under clinical trials for FDA approval, some of these drugs have shown to have some benefits for some of the symptoms that those who suffer from RA or lupus or Sjogren's seem to, it ameliorated some of those symptoms of those autoimmune disorders as well. These do come with some increased risks and increased toxicity compared to the hydroxychloroquine, certainly. But it's important to know that there are other immunosuppressants that could potentially be prescribed that could offer potential benefits, certainly. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that there's been lots of literature on the immune system and its regeneration and its repair and its support with stem cells and exosomes. They are thought to be, there's a lot of research going on outside this country largely, but also well within this country with regards to their immunomodulatory effect. Mesenchymal stem cells are multipotent and they're capable of self-renewal and differentiation into several cell lines. And so they can repair a lot of things that are ultimately damaged or working less efficiently from chronic inflammation and chronic stress on the body from the autoimmune disease. They help to manage inflammation and immunoregulatory cytokines in the way they work. They also inhibit clonal expansion of CD4 cells and chemokines, and they alter differentiation of B cells. And mesenchymal stem cells have their own exosomes, but some people do separate exosome therapies as well, which are just extracellular vesicles that have lots of their own cellular signaling molecules that help to modulate the immune system and reduce inflammation. Have some ability to regenerate because they contain mRNA, but the stem cells, of course, have DNA, which actually can then be transcribed to sort of further aid in regeneration of different cellular lines. So I think that it's just an important point that I should say, and I don't know if that's a quick answer to what to do if you can't get your plaquenil tomorrow, but I think in just terms of long term, I think one of the lessons that we're sort of learning from having lost access to medications that we've relied upon for so long is that sometimes we have to think outside the box and think of other ways of improving and repairing our health. And so with that, I will end my talk and take any questions.
Great, thank you so much for that, Dr. Ruhoy. I have a couple questions here. So someone has asked, typing in on the webinar tool in the question section, what is your opinion on the use of methotrexate or other immune suppressive drugs for undifferentiated connective tissue disease?
I mean, methotrexate is, we consider it like a steroid-sparing type of drug, that along with azathioprine. And I think that for mixed connective tissue disease, I think it's certainly worth a try. These drugs have been around for a fairly long time, and so we're very comfortable with its toxicity and any kind of surveillance we have to do in terms of monitoring parameters. And so as long as someone is following a patient closely and doing the appropriate monitoring and surveillance, I think that methotrexate actually has been used for a very long time in all age groups, frankly. So I think it's safe to use and might be beneficial.
Okay. So someone asks, should you avoid tonic water if you're already on plaquenil, hydroxychloroquine? So I wanted to add to what you were talking about before. I looked up, because I'm on plaquenil for Sjogren syndrome and had trouble getting it recently. So I looked up, how much tonic water would I actually have to drink to get a therapeutic dose. And so in the US, federal law requires that the tonic water you get at the grocery store has to be 83 milligrams or less of the active quinine substance in order to be sold as tonic water in the US. And I've read that some brands, it will be much less than that because it's not it's cheaper to sell you water with bubbles than it is to sell you a chemical. So, to get a dose that's equivalent to 200 milligrams a day of hydroxychloroquine, you'd have to drink liters and liters and liters of the stuff, which would probably leave you with hyponatremia and other problems. So I think of it as sort of something supplemental, but not something that's actually going to replace. You can't replace your plaquenil with tonic water.
Oh, I completely agree. Right, and that was my point about what would simulate the mechanism of action, and that might, but you wouldn't get therapeutic dosages, of course. And I agree. Trying to do so, you'd likely have other problems.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure our listeners aren't going out and trying to drink 20 liters a day of tonic water, because I don't think that's going to be such a good idea. So someone has asked, let's see, how long does someone have to do fasting before they might see an improvement, and how long is too long?
So if they're referring to just like true fasting, where you're consuming no nutrients whatsoever, I never recommend longer than 3 days. And I know that in the fasting world, they're a little bit more aggressive in that, and they say that you can fast a lot longer. I think 3 days would be the longest I would recommend. I know that there are places that you can go, there are fasting retreats that you can do 7 days and 30 days of fasting, I mean, with water. But I don't really recommend that. I think the body does require a steady supply of nutrients to some level, but I do think that the fasting research does hold weight. I think there are absolute benefits to reducing the stress on our bodies of having to, accommodate foodstuffs into our system. And I think that in general, overall, I think we all eat too much in terms of frequency of eating. I don't think we need to eat 5, 6 times a day. I think that again, that's what's important about the circadian aspect of our being. The rhythm actually includes meals, includes introduction of nutrients to the body, and so in my opinion, I don't recommend fasting for longer than 3 days. And I think that's certainly up for discussion amongst many, but that's my recommendation.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention if anybody listening has an eating disorder, I've talked to some other folks about this, and I think that people who have a history of having eating disorders really probably shouldn't do fasting unless you're under strict medical supervision. You don't want to kind of trigger your eating disorder again or something like that. So just
Absolutely.
kind of a word of caution about trying that on your own. And it's not when people do fasting for autoimmunity, it's not to lose weight, it's to sort of try to kind of rejigger their immune system into behaving differently. And definitely needs to be done with, even when you're fasting, you're still drinking water, right? And
Oh,
presumably some
absolutely. No,
salt for
so
our
yeah.
dysautonomia folks.
No, without question. I mean, obviously, hydration is always a rule. So regardless of how much food you're consuming, hydration is very important, especially for dysautonomia patients. And it's just, again, to sort of reduce the inflammation, which again comes from just the constant need for the body to metabolize the food, and then absorb it and utilize it, does take quite a bit of energy. And so that energy can be diverted and used elsewhere, for patients who are certainly in an acute flare of autoimmunity. And especially if you can't get your plaquenil or can't get the appropriate dosages of it, you could just even, just lower the calories, for example. But I completely agree with what you said, Lauren. Obviously, if you have a history of an eating disorder of any type, we don't want to trigger that. So this is just one, recommendation for some and not necessarily applicable to all. So that's very important.
So we have some folks asking on the NAC, what's the typical dosage that you use in your autoimmune patients?
So
And
I think, yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I hate to give dosing because I always like to know the patients before I recommend dosing, because I think it could vary based on medical history. I generally recommend 1 gram twice a day is where I start. So I think that's a safe dose. Some people go up as high as 4,800 milligrams a day. But I always start at sort of 1 gram twice a day. And I think like I said, it's actually being recommended by many physicians with regard to prevention for COVID-19. And it's because of its anti-inflammatory and antioxidant capabilities.
So someone's asking if someone has some plaquenil left but is not able to get it, should they take it every other day? And I just want to answer that because I've talked to my own doctors about that. I think it's really important to talk to the doctor who prescribed your plaquenil. I know Dr. Ruhoy wants to give us helpful information, but I think it's a bad idea for anyone who's got an autoimmune disease and is on a medication. You obviously have a doctor who's prescribed your plaquenil, so you should be calling them and asking them that. There are patients on the support groups talking about taking it every other day or something like that to try to stretch out the dose they have until they can get a refill. But Dr. Ruhoy, did you want to add to that? I just wanted to throw that out there that
I completely agree with what you said. I mean, I concur. I mean, I think that everyone should talk to their prescribing provider if you have an active prescription of plaquenil, because they obviously are responsible for how you're responding to the medication. And if you're going to change the dose in any way, it should definitely be run by them. In general, if the body has gotten used to a certain dosage of a certain immunomodulator, medication, oftentimes changing up that dose can sometimes cause symptoms, though not always. And so it's really important to sort of to stay in connection with your prescribing provider so that they can help manage not only the dosing but any kind of flare that may result.
Are there medications that can't be mixed with quercetin, something like, you know, the grapefruit interactions and stuff? Are there things to look out for if someone's doing quercetin supplements?
So which medication did they gave it?
Uh,
Was there an
Quercetin,
example?
am I saying it wrong?
No, you're saying it correctly. I thought somebody had mentioned a medication that you can't take with it.
Like, are there contraindications to taking that in terms of like, don't take it if you're drinking grapefruit juice, or don't take it if you're on beta blockers? Like, is there any interactions?
No, so at appropriate dosages, there are no interactions. Obviously, you know, if you're taking a lot of different other mast cell stabilizers and a lot of mast cell stabilizing medications, you certainly don't need to sort of compound the mechanism of action on top of one another. But I think that at sort of dosages that are low and otherwise appropriate, there's no significant concern for drug-drug interactions and toxicity. I mean,
Yeah.
so a lot of the quercetin supplements come with excipients. So a lot of mast cell patients will have reactions to the excipients. And so sometimes people try to get it compounded so it could be a little bit more pure.
Yeah.
So if you're particularly hypersensitive to medications and supplements, that might be something of concern.
Yep. Somebody says they've been diagnosed with autoimmune autonomic ganglionopathy, which is a rare form of dysautonomia,
Mhm.
and they're waiting to get IVIG approval, and they're wondering if plaquenil would help in the meanwhile. And I'm not the doctor here, but I don't think plaquenil is particularly helpful for AAG, but I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
No, I agree. You are the doctor here. I think uh, Plaquenil is not considered a medication for AAG, no, and I think that IVIG is the appropriate first place to start, and very different mechanism of action actually, and so I don't think Plaquenil would be useful.
Yeah, there are everybody who has AAG, or everybody who has an autoimmune disease where they're trying to use high dose IVIG or sub-Q. That stands for intravenous immunoglobulin or subcutaneous immunoglobulin, just same drug, just given in a different manner. That always gets denied. There's always insurance appeals. It takes forever to get that drug approved because it's so expensive. So it's really hard when you're that patient waiting for the drug, you know, urgently wanting to get it started. Sometimes not everyone with AAG, but some people with AAG respond well to intravenous steroids, but not always. And some also respond to things like Rituxan or other pretty potent immune suppressing drugs, or even plasmapheresis.
Yes.
But it's such a rare disease that there actually isn't a lot of research to guide what the effective treatments are. Just as an example, the Autonomic Disorders Consortium, which is a network of the major autonomic labs, Harvard, Mayo, Vanderbilt, UT Southwestern, NIH, and NYU, they tried to do an IVIG clinical trial in AAG. And in like 2 or 3 years of running the trial, they only enrolled 2 patients because
Oh.
they applied the strict diagnostic criteria. And so a lot of doctors are diagnosing AAG now when people don't officially meet the criteria, but they kind of look like they have it. So going with the very strict criteria, it's an extremely rare disease. So they were only able to enroll 2 people in the IVIG trial, and guess what happened? It helped one of the patients, and it didn't help one of the other patients. So that doesn't really give us much guidance on what to do for AAG.
Yeah, I
But
have a couple of AAG patients, and they are actually once I'm still awaiting approval, but 2 others actually are on AAG and have done really well, but it certainly wasn't a panacea. They are definitely more functional than they had been without question, but they still have flares for clearly, you know, for no clear reason. So yeah, so I agree though with what you said. I'm considering doing rituximab for them as well. Um,
some of the literature suggests that these patients need combo immunotherapy,
Right.
which is not unheard of in other autoimmune diseases too, where, I think that a lot of patients where you have all these symptoms, you're probably sick for years before you get diagnosed, and then you're told something like you have Sjogren's or you have rheumatoid
Right.
arthritis, and it's kind of this weight being lifted off your shoulders, like, okay, I have an answer now. But the truth is, Sjogren syndrome is actually probably 40 different biological mechanisms that kind of all present the same. They're not the same thing though, and they don't all respond to the same treatments. And so the same thing with POTS, right? POTS is not officially an autoimmune condition or anything like that yet, and maybe won't be at the end of the day when the research is done. But it's not one thing. There's probably 20 different things that cause POTS. So when we hear about a treatment that worked for you know this other patient that has Sjogren's, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for us. And that's a real frustration for patients and for doctors, because doctors want a rule book to play by.
Yes.
So, so anyways,
I always
I'll
say
probably,
there's no great blueprint for any patient, right? I think that every patient requires their own personalized plan, and often it's a little bit of trial and error. And so I think always the hope is, I always tell patients just, let's just work together and we'll
yeah,
find what works for you. And as you know, it's never the same for each patient. It's always a different regimen of sorts.
yeah,
And so certainly these recommendations that I made are obviously recommendations, and it's not necessarily going to be the perfect thing for everyone. So it's always, trying to find the right plan for each individual patient, I think is what's important.
yeah. Lots of trial and error and
Yes.
working. So important to find a doctor who's willing to work with you and kind of acknowledges that we have to figure things out, because you can read all the medical journals out there and it still doesn't tell you how to effectively treat a lot of this stuff.
No, no,
So
and that sometimes the titles of the articles get me excited, and I think, oh, this is going to give me the answer. And then you read it, and it's a lot of great information, but at the end, you're like, okay, so what do I do?
yeah,
What do I
I
do next?
wanted to take one last question and then
Oh,
we can
sorry.
probably wrap up.
Sure.
The last question is, so a patient is asking, since people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome have trouble with, I'm always going to pronounce this wrong, um, fluoroquinolones, like the antibiotics
Uh-huh.
that cause connective tissue stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a thought process. I don't know that there's major credible research on this, but I certainly hear about it enough on the support groups that people with EDS, because they have connective tissue problems to begin with, that they are maybe a little bit more likely to have problems when they take certain antibiotics. Does that same problem occur with plaquenil?
I think again, there's no research to support that answer at all, other than to say that I think what we have seen, especially in those with EDS, is that any drug, or certainly any infectious exposure even, that has an inflammatory effect that induces inflammation in the body can ultimately have a negative and detrimental effect on the connective tissue, especially if that's where your vulnerable spot is, right? Your Achilles heel is in your connective tissue. So I think it's plausible, certainly, but I don't think it's been reported. I don't think that it's been, commonly seen and even pondered, probably because the plaquenil has been so effective in minimizing some of the other symptoms for those who are on it and stay on it. But I wouldn't discount that effect, but I don't know if I can say for sure.
Yeah, I've heard of there's a Dr. Francomano, sort of the queen of EDS research, had a abstract back in 2006. It never got turned into a full manuscript, but I saved this abstract and cite it all the time. She found a higher rate of autoimmunity in her hypermobile EDS patients than you would expect in the general population. And our big POTS survey data showed the same thing, that people with EDS and POTS are actually more likely to have autoimmune disease than people with POTS who don't have EDS.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know why that is. And we don't know, we just, that's the answer. We don't know why that is. But I do know a lot of EDS patients are on plaquenil because they have these overlapping autoimmune problems.
Right.
So I don't see a ton of people talking about connective tissue stuff from like damage from plaquenil.
Right.
And I also hear from Lyme patients who take plaquenil for like arthritis type pain,
Hmm.
and they seem to do well on it. But it's not a benign drug. There's all this talk in the media about it, and I do worry because I think you mentioned this in your talk. It can cause some retinal issues in people, and it's just in general. Anytime you're messing with your immune system, a certain subset of people are going to have a bad reaction to that.
Absolutely. No,
So,
absolutely. I mean, obviously, I think if our goal all should be that we don't need these kinds of drugs that all have some level of toxicity, right? There's some toxic profile to every pharmaceutical we prescribe, but you hope that the benefits outweigh the risks, and you hope that the patients tolerate it for a long term. And as long as you do the right monitoring and follow them closely, you can protect them. But if the more that we can do naturally to support our bodies, I think that's sort of what I advocate for. And I'm not against drugs; I prescribe them all the time. But I really do believe in also harnessing our own natural ability to sort of help ourselves. And so the combination, I think, is really where probably the sweet spot is, where we don't need lots of those medications or high doses of those medications, and we just sort of do our own part in our own health. And so that's what I try to advocate for.
well, I think that is an excellent closing point, and I'm so glad that you gave us this talk. It's the first time we've really had anyone talk on sort of non-pharmaceutical stuff, alternative medicine or supplementary or integrative medicine. And I think there's a large portion of our patient community that is really interested in this information. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you
Uh,
for inviting me.
thanks for everyone for listening. We will post this on our autonomic disorders video library, and everyone who tuned in and who registered will get an email copy of the video too. Have a good night. Stay safe.